The spring evening air carried the scent of rain as Miss Georgiana Fairfax stepped from her family's carriage onto the cobblestones of Belgrave Square, her hand trembling slightly as she accepted her father's arm and forced herself to breathe slowly through the tightness in her chest that had become her constant companion these past months. Lady Hertford's mansion blazed before them like a temple of judgment, every window ablaze with candlelight that spilled onto the street, where dozens of carriages queued to deliver London's most distinguished families to what everyone agreed was the season's most important ball. And Georgiana knew with a certainty that made her stomach clench that tonight would likely decide the rest of her life. Lord Fairfax squeezed her elbow gently, the gesture meant to be reassuring, but only reminding her of how much thinner he had become since the railway investments had failed, how the lines around his eyes had deepened with worry he tried to hide from her, and she straightened her spine and lifted her chin because she would not add to his burdens by showing her own fear. Her gown of ivory silk with delicate rose embroidery had cost more than they could afford, one final extravagance her father had insisted upon, saying his daughter would not enter the marriage market looking like a pauper, even if they were dangerously close to becoming exactly that. And as they climbed the marble steps between towering columns, she caught sight of her reflection in the great glass doors and barely recognized the poised young woman in expensive silk, her chestnut hair arranged in an elaborate style that had taken her maid 2 hours to perfect, her face carefully composed into an expression of serene pleasantness that revealed nothing of the desperation churning beneath. The butler announced them in ringing tones that carried across the entrance hall, and Georgiana felt the familiar weight of eyes turning toward them, assessing, calculating, determining their worth with the cold precision of merchants at market, and she knew what they saw. A once prominent family now teetering on the edge of ruin, a daughter of good breeding and adequate looks, whose primary value lay in her willingness to accept a match that would restore her family's fortunes, regardless of her own feelings on the matter. Lord Edmund Whitmore materialized at her side almost before they had cleared the receiving line, his broad face flushed with the self-satisfaction of a man who believed himself generous for courting a woman beneath his financial status, and he bowed over her hand with proprietary confidence that made her skin prickle with instinctive resistance she had no right to indulge. "I have been counting the minutes until your arrival, Miss Fairfax," he declared, loud enough for those nearby to hear, his fingers lingering on hers longer than necessary as he smiled at her father with the expression of a man who had already closed a business deal and was merely waiting for the papers to be signed. Lord Fairfax returned the smile with visible relief because Edmund Whitmore represented salvation, a wealthy viscount whose income from northern coal mines would not only rescue them from debt, but restore their social position. And it did not matter that Edmund spoke to Georgiana as if she were a promising horse he intended to purchase, or that his idea of courtship consisted of lengthy monologues about his own importance, punctuated by perfunctory inquiries into her needlework. They entered the ballroom, and Georgiana's breath caught despite everything, because Lady Hertford had transformed the enormous space into something from a fairy tale. Thousands of candles blazing in crystal chandeliers that cast dancing light across floor-to-ceiling mirrors, multiplying the crowd of 400 guests in their finest silks and jewels into what seemed like thousands, an endless sea of wealth and privilege that she was meant to join permanently through marriage to a man she could barely tolerate. The orchestra played from the mezzanine level, the sweet strains of a waltz floating down over the crowd, and through the French doors that stood open to the gardens she could see couples stealing moments of relative privacy beneath the moonlight, their shadows merging in ways that made her chest ache with longing for something she had no name for and no right to want. Edmund was speaking again, something about his newest carriage, or perhaps his London house. She had stopped listening as she scanned the crowd with the practiced eye of someone who had attended these events since she was 17 and had learned to read the subtle hierarchies and shifting alliances that governed their world, noting which families stood together and which maintained careful distance, which young ladies had secured the attention of eligible gentlemen, and which stood with the slightly desperate brightness of those running out of time. Then her gaze snagged on a figure standing alone near the terrace doors, slightly apart from the crowd, and her heart performed an odd little skip that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with the dark-haired man whose very stillness seemed to command attention more effectively than movement ever could. Sebastian Wentworth, the Duke of Ashford, was watching her with an intensity that made heat rise to her cheeks, his grey eyes fixed on her face with a focus that felt almost physical, and for a moment the crowded ballroom seemed to fall away until there was only that steady gaze that saw her in a way no one had looked at her in longer than she could remember. She had never been formally introduced to the Duke, though of course she knew who he was. Everyone did. The most desired bachelor in England, who had rejected every matrimonial scheme for 7 years with such consistent coldness that mothers had stopped throwing their daughters at him and started warning them that the Duke of Ashford had ice where his heart should be. He was taller than most men in the room, his dark evening clothes perfectly tailored to emphasize broad shoulders and a lean, athletic build, his features aristocratic and severe, with high cheekbones and a firm mouth that looked unused to smiling, and there was something in his bearing that suggested coiled tension, a man holding himself in rigid check for reasons Georgiana could not begin to guess. Edmund's hand closed on her arm, drawing her attention back with the subtle pressure of ownership, and when she glanced back toward the terrace doors, the Duke was still watching her, but now his jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly as Edmund steered her toward the dance floor with the confident assumption that her card belonged to him by right. The first dance was a country reel that required concentration, giving Georgiana an excuse not to respond to Edmund's running commentary on the various guests, their fortunes, their scandals, their weaknesses that he catalogued with the glee of someone who enjoyed feeling superior. And she smiled and nodded and tried not to notice that the Duke had moved to a position where he could observe the dancers, his expression unreadable, but his attention never wavering from her. By the third dance, her feet were beginning to ache, and her face hurt from maintaining her pleasant mask, and she realized with growing despair that Edmund had effectively monopolized her entire card, his name scrawled across every line in his bold, aggressive hand, a territorial display that announced to every man in the room that Georgiana Fairfax was already claimed. She caught whispers behind fans as she passed, pitying glances from older matrons who had once been fond of her mother, speculative looks from younger ladies who were relieved not to be in her position, and through it all she held her head high and pretended not to care that her future was being decided by financial necessity, rather than anything resembling affection or respect. The supper interval brought temporary reprieve, and she found herself seated at Edmund's side at one of the small tables arranged in the supper room, where ice sculptures slowly melted between champagne fountains and elaborate displays of delicacies that made her stomach turn because she knew she could not eat a bite past the knot of anxiety that had taken up permanent residence in her throat. Edmund held court at their table, regaling his companions with a story about a business rival he had bested, and then quite suddenly he turned to her, and in a voice loud enough to carry to the neighboring tables, announced that he intended to call on Lord Fairfax the following morning to formalize certain arrangements. "I shall speak to Lord Fairfax tomorrow," he declared with the satisfaction of a man making a magnanimous gesture. "Miss Fairfax has been bred for this role, and she understands her duty. Don't you, my dear?" It was not really a question, and every eye at their table and several nearby turned to her, waiting for her response, and Georgiana felt something crack inside her chest, even as she maintained her composure and replied in a voice that sounded distant to her own ears. "I understand what is expected of me, Lord Whitmore." His smile widened with triumph, and he patted her hand as one might pat a particularly obedient dog, and she had to look away before the tears burning behind her eyes could escape and humiliate her further, her gaze finding without conscious direction the far corner where the Duke of Ashford sat alone at a small table, his untouched plate before him, and his eyes fixed on her with an expression she could not read, but that made her breath catch. The rest of supper passed in a blur of forced conversation, and the growing awareness that she was being discussed, dissected, her fate decided in the whispers that followed Edmund's announcement. And when they returned to the ballroom for the final set of dances, she moved like a woman in a dream, disconnected from her own body, watching herself perform the steps with mechanical precision. The orchestra struck up the final waltz, and Georgiana felt a sudden wild hope that perhaps she might sit this one out, claim fatigue or the heat, anything for a moment alone to compose herself before the carriage ride home, where her father would ask with anxious hopefulness if Edmund had spoken to her, and she would have to confirm that, yes, tomorrow their lives would change irrevocably. Then she saw the Duke of Ashford moving through the crowd toward her, his expression determined, and her heart began to race with something that felt dangerously like hope as he drew near and made a slight bow in her direction. "Miss Fairfax, might I?" he began, his voice deeper than she had imagined, cultured and precise. But Edmund stepped smoothly between them, his body language aggressively territorial as he smiled at the Duke with cold politeness. "The Duke of Ashford? How unexpected," Edmund said, his hand possessive on Georgiana's elbow. "I'm afraid my intended's card is quite full. Perhaps next season you'll be quicker, though I hear you don't dance." The insult was subtle, but unmistakable, and Georgiana watched the Duke's expression shudder, all emotion draining from his face until he was once again the cold aristocrat of reputation. And when his eyes met hers, she saw something there that made her chest ache, a flash of fury and frustration, and something else she could not name before it disappeared behind perfect control. "I don't," he said quietly, his gaze never leaving Georgiana's face. "Usually." The word hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning she could not quite grasp, and then he turned slightly to address her directly as Edmund's grip on her arm tightened. "Good evening, Miss Fairfax," the Duke said, his voice gentle in a way that made tears prick her eyes again. "I hope you find what you're looking for." Then he turned and walked away, his tall figure cutting through the crowd with unconscious authority, and Georgiana watched him go with the terrible certainty that she had just lost something precious she had never even known she wanted. Edmund led her onto the floor for the final waltz, smug with victory, and as they moved through the familiar steps, Georgiana felt the last of her hope drain away, leaving only the hollow resignation of a woman who had just watched her future close around her like a gilded cage. The ballroom had grown oppressively hot, the combined warmth of 400 bodies and thousands of candles making the air thick and hard to breathe, and through the tall windows she could see that the promised storm had arrived, rain beginning to patter against the glass in a rhythm that matched the ache in her chest. By the time the music ended and Edmund finally released her to her father's care, Georgiana felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with dancing and everything to do with the weight of duty and expectation that pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. The Duke of Ashford was nowhere to be seen as they made their way to the entrance hall to wait for their carriage, and she told herself it did not matter, that a man like that would never have seriously considered a woman in her position anyway, that the moment of connection she had felt was nothing but her own desperate imagination conjuring romance where there was only pity. The rain had intensified by the time their carriage arrived, drumming on the roof as they settled inside for the short ride home, and Lord Fairfax smiled at her in the darkness with relief and gratitude that made her want to weep. "Lord Whitmore seems very pleased," her father said gently. "You have done well tonight, my dear." Georgiana nodded because she could not trust her voice, and as the carriage rolled through the wet London streets, she pressed her forehead against the cool glass and watched the blurred lights pass by, trying not to think about grey eyes that had seen her with uncomfortable clarity, or the way her heart had raced when the Duke of Ashford had said her name, because none of that mattered now. Tomorrow Edmund would call on her father, arrangements would be made, contracts would be signed, and she would become what she had always been destined to be, a solution to a financial problem, a woman whose worth was measured in pounds and social connections rather than in dreams or desires or anything resembling love. But for now, in the privacy of the dark carriage with rain obscuring the world outside, she allowed herself one moment of grief for the life she would never have, the choice she had never been given, before she straightened her spine and prepared to face the future that duty demanded, little knowing that across London in his Mayfair townhouse, Sebastian Wentworth, Duke of Ashford, sat in his study with a glass of untouched brandy and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. The morning light filtering through the study windows held none of the promise that spring mornings should carry, and Georgiana sat rigidly in the chair her father had indicated, her hands folded in her lap with the precise deportment that years of training had made automatic, while Lord Fairfax paced behind his desk with an energy she had not seen in months, his face animated with relief that made her heart sink even as she tried to feel grateful that at least one of them would find happiness in the arrangement being finalized today. Edmund was expected within the hour. His note had arrived with breakfast announcing his intention to call on Lord Fairfax regarding a matter of mutual interest and benefit, the phrasing so coldly transactional that Georgiana had set down her tea untouched and excused herself from the breakfast table before her father could see the despair she could no longer quite hide. The study smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather, familiar scents from childhood when she would sit on the floor while her father worked and her mother read aloud from whatever novel had captured her fancy. But those days felt impossibly distant now, separated from the present by her mother's death and her father's poor investments and the slow erosion of everything that had once felt secure. Lord Fairfax was saying something about settlements and arrangements, his voice bright with the forced optimism of a man trying to convince himself that selling his daughter to save his estate was a reasonable solution rather than a tragedy, and Georgiana made appropriate sounds of acknowledgement while her mind drifted to the memory of grey eyes watching her across a crowded ballroom, the Duke of Ashford's intensity as he had tried to claim that final dance, the flash of something almost like pain when Edmund had dismissed him with casual cruelty. She told herself to stop thinking about it, that the Duke's momentary interest had been nothing but pity or perhaps idle curiosity, that men of his station did not seriously consider women whose families were teetering on the edge of ruin, and yet she could not shake the feeling that something significant had passed between them in those few seconds before Edmund had intervened, some recognition that she had no words to describe and no right to indulge. A sharp knock at the study door made them both start, and Lord Fairfax straightened his waistcoat with visible pleasure, assuming Edmund had arrived early in his eagerness to formalize their agreement, but instead the footman who entered looked distinctly flustered as he announced that the Duke of Ashford was here and requesting an immediate audience with Lord Fairfax on a matter of utmost urgency. The silence that followed this pronouncement was so complete that Georgiana could hear the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sounds of horses on the street outside, and she felt her heart begin to race with a mixture of confusion and something dangerously close to hope that she tried desperately to suppress, because hope, in her position, was a cruelty she could not afford. Lord Fairfax recovered first, his expression shifting from surprise to uncertainty to careful calculation as he instructed the footman to show the Duke in immediately, and Georgiana barely had time to stand and smooth her morning dress of pale green muslin before Sebastian Wentworth entered the study with the controlled power of a man who had spent the night making decisions and was now here to execute them with military precision. He was even more imposing in the morning light than he had been in the candlelit ballroom, his dark hair slightly disheveled as though he had been running his hands through it, his cravat tied with less than his usual perfection, suggesting he had dressed in haste, and there was something in his eyes as they found hers that made her breath catch, an intensity that spoke of determination and something else she was afraid to name. "Your Grace?" Lord Fairfax stammered, clearly thrown by this unprecedented visit. "This is most unexpected. Please, sit, may I offer you refreshment? I confess I cannot imagine what matter brings you to call at such an early hour." Sebastian remained standing, his attention shifting to Lord Fairfax with the focused courtesy of a man who had something important to say, and intended to say it without the usual social niceties that normally governed such interactions. "Lord Fairfax, I apologize for the intrusion and the unconventional hour, but I have a proposition that I believe requires immediate discussion before certain other arrangements are finalized." He glanced at Georgiana again, something almost like apology in his expression, before continuing with a directness that was both shocking and strangely refreshing after years of navigating society's endless indirection. "I am prepared to settle £50,000 immediately, with an additional £20,000 upon conclusion of the season, in exchange for exclusive rights to every dance on Miss Fairfax's card for the remainder of the social calendar." The words hung in the air like something solid, and Georgiana felt the room tilt slightly as she struggled to process what she had just heard, while her father made a strangled sound that might have been surprise or confusion, or both. Sebastian continued speaking with the same calm precision, as though he were discussing a business contract rather than something utterly unprecedented in the history of London society. "Every ball, every musicale, every social engagement where Miss Fairfax might be expected to dance, she dances only with me, or sits out entirely. The arrangement would continue through the end of the season, at which point both parties would be free to dissolve it with no further obligation." Lord Fairfax had gone pale and then flushed, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as he stared at the Duke with an expression caught between shock and desperate hope, because £70,000 would not only erase their debts, but restore their fortune to something approaching its former stability, and Georgiana watched her father's face and saw the moment temptation won over propriety. "Your Grace, this is— I have never heard of such an arrangement," Lord Fairfax managed, his voice unsteady. "What are your intentions toward my daughter?" The question was reasonable, the concern of any father faced with such an irregular proposal, but Sebastian's answer was not what either of them expected. To give her what every woman deserves and few receive, a choice. He turned to look directly at Georgiana as he spoke, his grey eyes holding hers with an honesty that was almost painful in its nakedness. "I would like to speak with Miss Fairfax privately, if I may, before any decisions are made. She must agree to this arrangement willingly, or I withdraw the offer entirely." Lord Fairfax looked between them, clearly torn between the impropriety of leaving them unchaperoned and the desperate need to secure an agreement that would save them from ruin. And finally he nodded slowly and excused himself with instructions that they might use the library, that he would wait in the drawing-room, his voice trailing off as he left, as though he could not quite believe what was happening. Sebastian waited until the door closed behind Lord Fairfax before gesturing for Georgiana to precede him to the library, and she moved in a daze through the familiar hallways of her home that suddenly felt strange and dreamlike, her mind spinning with questions and suspicions and a wild fluttering in her chest that might have been panic or excitement or some combination of both. The library was her favorite room in the house, floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with books that had been her companions through her mother's death and her father's withdrawal, though now there were gaps where volumes had been sold to collectors, empty spaces that spoke eloquently of their changed circumstances. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows overlooking the small garden, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air, and the intimacy of the space, just the two of them alone with the door closed, felt simultaneously dangerous and thrilling, in ways that made Georgiana acutely aware of her racing pulse. She turned to face him, drawing on reserves of composure she had not known she possessed, and lifted her chin with the pride of a woman who had been humiliated enough and would not suffer it again without protest. "So I am to be traded from one man's possession to another's," she said, her voice trembling slightly with anger she could no longer contain. "How is this different from Lord Whitmore's presumption?" Sebastian flinched as though she had struck him, and for a moment his careful control slipped enough that she saw genuine pain cross his features before he mastered it and stepped closer, though still maintaining a respectful distance that somehow made his intensity more affecting rather than less. Because you can say no, he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion he was clearly struggling to contain. Right now. Say no, and I will leave and never speak of this again. Your father need never know this conversation happened. I will tell him you found the arrangement insulting and I withdrew the offer. You can accept Whitmore's suit or find another match or do whatever you choose, but it will be your choice, not mine. Georgiana stared at him, searching his face for any sign of mockery or cruelty, and finding only earnest sincerity that disarmed her anger and left her floundering in confusion. And if I say yes? She asked after a long pause during which she was intensely aware of the sound of her own breathing. What happens at the end of the season? Whatever you wish, Sebastian replied, his eyes never leaving hers. I make no claims on you beyond the dances I have paid for. If at the end of the season you decide you prefer Whitmore or another suitor, you are free to accept them. If you decide you prefer to remain unmarried, that is also your right. I will not use this arrangement to manipulate or coerce you into anything beyond what we explicitly agree to now. It was too much, too unprecedented, and Georgiana felt her defenses crumbling under the weight of his directness, even as her pride bristled at the fundamental transaction underlying his offer. Men always want something, Your Grace, she said, the words coming out more bitter than she had intended. What do you really want from this arrangement? Sebastian was silent for a long moment, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her soul, and when he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to lean slightly forward to hear him clearly. Yes, he said. I want to see you smile without that look of resignation you wore last night. I watched that man treat you like chattel, like a possession he had already acquired, and I saw something die in your eyes with each dance, each proprietary touch, each word that reminded you that your worth was being measured in pounds rather than in the qualities that actually matter. I want to give you time and freedom to choose your own path, even if that path does not include me. I will pay any price for that, even if the smile I am hoping to see is never directed at me. The raw honesty of his words stole her breath, and she had to look away from the naked vulnerability in his expression, her mind racing through the implications of what he was offering. It was still a transaction, still money exchanged for her company, but he was right that there was a crucial difference. He was offering her choice rather than demanding compliance, and she could walk away at the end with no obligation beyond what she willingly gave. She thought of Edmund's presumptuous announcement at supper, his hand on her arm like a brand of ownership, the way he had dismissed the Duke's attempt to claim a dance, as though Georgiana had no say in the matter, and she felt anger kindle again in her chest, not at Sebastian, but at the entire system that had brought her to this moment where her choices were limited to which man's offer she would accept. I need to understand something, she said finally, turning back to face him with her arms wrapped around herself, as though she could hold in the confusion and fear and desperate hope that threatened to overwhelm her. Why? Why me? Why this? Why now? You could have any woman in London. You have rejected every debutante for 7 years, and now you suddenly decide to make this unprecedented offer to a woman you have never even been properly introduced to. What am I missing? Sebastian moved to the window, staring out at the garden as though the answer might be written in the carefully tended flower beds, and when he spoke his voice carried the weight of truths he had clearly not intended to share, but found himself compelled to voice anyway. I spent 7 years avoiding marriage because I watched my father destroy my mother through the gradual erosion of her spirit, he said quietly. He married her for her fortune and treated her with cold courtesy that was somehow worse than cruelty might have been. She withered in that marriage, became a shadow of the vibrant woman she had been, and when she died I swore I would never trap another woman in such an arrangement. But last night I watched Whitmore treat you exactly as my father treated my mother, as a valuable acquisition rather than a person, and I saw in your eyes the same resignation my mother wore, and something in me simply could not allow it to happen again without at least trying to intervene." He turned back to face her, his expression raw with emotion. "I have no grand plan, Miss Fairfax. I do not know what I am doing beyond knowing that I could not wake up this morning and let you accept Whitmore's suit without offering you an alternative. Perhaps in 3 months you will decide that a marriage of convenience to him is preferable to whatever this arrangement might become. That is your right, but at least it will be a choice you make freely rather than one forced on you by circumstance." Georgiana felt tears prick her eyes at the painful honesty in his words. This powerful duke who could have anything he wanted, admitting that he was acting on impulse and emotion rather than calculated strategy. And she realized that he was taking as much of a risk as she was, perhaps more, because he was violating every rule he had set for himself in order to offer her freedom. The silence stretched between them, weighted with possibility and danger in equal measure, and she knew that whatever she decided in this moment would alter the course of her life irrevocably. "If I agree," she said slowly, testing each word before she spoke it, "I want your promise that at the end of the season I am truly free to choose. No manipulation, no pressure, no using my father's gratitude or my own sense of obligation to coerce me into a match I do not want." Sebastian crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides, taking her hands in his with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his obvious intensity. "You have my word as a gentleman and as a duke," he said firmly. "At the end of the season, you are free to choose whatever and whomever you wish. I will accept your decision without protest or interference." She searched his face one more time, looking for any sign of deception and finding only earnest sincerity that made her chest ache with something she was afraid to examine too closely. "Very well," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I accept your offer, Your Grace." Something shifted in Sebastian's expression, relief and triumph, and something else that made her pulse quicken, but he simply bowed over her hands with perfect courtesy and said quietly, "Thank you, Miss Fairfax. I promise you will not regret this." They returned to the study where Lord Fairfax waited with barely concealed anxiety, and Sebastian laid out the terms with businesslike efficiency, the immediate settlement, the additional payment at season's end, the exclusive arrangement regarding all social dancing, the freedom for both parties to withdraw at the conclusion without further obligation. Lord Fairfax listened with an expression that cycled through shock and hope and disbelief, and when Sebastian asked if the terms were acceptable, her father nodded slowly, his eyes finding Georgiana's, with a question she answered with a small nod of her own. The Duke produced papers already drawn up by his solicitors, evidence that he had spent the entire night not sleeping but planning this intervention with meticulous care, and within an hour the agreements were signed, and Sebastian was taking his leave with a promise to call the following day to discuss their first social engagement together. After he left, Georgiana stood at the study window and watched his carriage roll away down the street, and tried to ignore the fact that her hands were shaking and her heart was racing, and nothing in her carefully ordered world made sense anymore. Lord Fairfax came to stand beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Are you quite certain about this, my dear?" he asked quietly. "It is most irregular, and I would not have you feel pressured into an arrangement that makes you uncomfortable, even if the financial relief is considerable." Georgiana turned to him with a small smile that felt more genuine than any expression she had managed in months. "I am certain, Papa," she said. "For the first time in a very long time, I am choosing something for myself rather than accepting what circumstances dictate. That alone makes it worthwhile, whatever comes of it." Within hours the news had spread through London society with the speed of wildfire, servants gossiping to servants, morning callers noting the Duke of Ashford's early visit to the Fairfax residence, and by afternoon the drawing-rooms of Mayfair were buzzing with speculation about The unprecedented arrangement between the cold duke and the impoverished beauty he had apparently decided to claim for himself. The gossips dissected every possible interpretation, some calling it romantic, others scandalous. Many convinced that Georgiana must be the duke's mistress in all but name, and that the dancing arrangement was merely a convenient fiction to maintain appearances. Georgiana heard none of it yet, sequestered in her room where she sat at her writing desk and tried to compose a letter to her aunt in the country explaining what had transpired. But the words would not come because she herself did not fully understand what had happened, or what it meant, or why her heart felt lighter than it had in years, despite the scandal she knew was brewing. Outside her window, London carried on with its usual business. Carriages rolling past, vendors calling their wares, the city humming with life and gossip, and the endless social machinations that governed their world. And somewhere across the city, Sebastian Wentworth sat in his study and stared at the signed agreement on his desk, and wondered what madness had possessed him to do something so completely contrary to every principle he had lived by for the past 7 years, knowing only that when he had watched Georgiana Fairfax's eyes dim with resignation at Lady Hertford's ball, he had felt something crack open inside his chest that he had thought permanently sealed, and that he would pay any price, face any scandal, risk any consequence to see her smile without that terrible look of defeat that had haunted him through the sleepless night. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The 3 days between Sebastian's unprecedented offer and their first public appearance together had passed in a blur of anxious preparation and mounting dread. And now Georgiana stood in her dressing room while her maid fastened the final hooks of her gown, a creation of midnight blue silk that her father had insisted on purchasing despite her protests, saying that if she was to be the subject of London's gossip, she would at least look magnificent while enduring it. And she had to admit, as she studied her reflection, that the deep blue brought out the amber in her eyes and made her skin glow like cream against the rich fabric. The whispers had already begun, of course, spreading through drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs with vicious speed, some calling the arrangement romantic in that breathless way people spoke of fairy tales, others declaring it the height of scandal, and more than a few convinced with absolute certainty that Georgiana had become the Duke of Ashford's mistress, and the dancing arrangement was merely a convenient fiction to allow them to appear together publicly without completely destroying what remained of her reputation. She had heard it all from well-meaning friends who called to express concern, and from her father's business associates who could not quite hide their speculation behind polite congratulations. And with each retelling she had felt the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders until she could barely breathe under the scrutiny of a society that had once ignored her and now watched her every move with rabid fascination. Sebastian's carriage arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, and Georgiana descended the stairs with her heart hammering against her ribs in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the physical exertion and everything to do with the knowledge that tonight would either validate her choice or prove it the worst mistake of her life. He was waiting in the entrance hall, immaculate in black evening clothes that emphasized his height and the breadth of his shoulders, and when he looked up at her approach, something flickered in his grey eyes that made her breath catch, an expression too quickly masked but unmistakably appreciative, and she felt heat rise to her cheeks at the intensity of his gaze. "You look beautiful," he said simply, the words quiet enough that only she could hear, and there was nothing practiced or artificial in the compliment, just a statement of fact delivered with the same directness that characterized everything about him. She murmured her thanks and accepted his arm, feeling the solid strength of him beneath the fine fabric of his coat, and as they walked to the waiting carriage, she was acutely aware of the neighbors' curtains twitching, the whispers that would follow this departure, the fact that her life had become a spectacle for others to dissect and judge. The Duchess of Somerset's estate in Kensington was even grander than Lady Hertford's Belgravia mansion, its massive stone facade lit by hundreds of lanterns that transformed the formal gardens into something from a dream. And as their carriage rolled up the long drive, Georgiana could see other arrivals. A river of silk and jewels flowing toward the entrance, and she felt her anxiety spike to near panic. "I can feel them all watching," she whispered as they descended from the carriage and joined the stream of guests, her hand tightening on Sebastian's arm. This was a terrible idea. "Then let them watch," he replied calmly, covering her hand with his own in a gesture that was both reassuring and possessive. "They will see a beautiful woman dancing with the luckiest man in London." She looked up at him sharply, searching his face for mockery and finding only steady sincerity. "You do not believe that?" she said, half statement and half question. "Do I not?" he countered, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "I am the only man here who gets to dance with you. Seems fortunate to me." The entrance hall was a soaring space of marble and gold, and the moment they appeared together the whispers began, a susurrus of sound that followed them like a wake as they made their way toward the ballroom. Georgiana kept her chin high and her expression serene, drawing on years of training that had taught her to mask her true feelings behind a pleasant facade. But inside, she felt exposed and vulnerable in a way that made her want to flee back to the safety of her father's house. The ballroom itself was breathtaking, its domed ceiling painted with classical scenes of gods and heroes, the walls hung with silk in shades of cream and gold, and chandeliers so massive they seemed to hold entire constellations of candles that cast dancing light across the crowd of at least 500 guests, more than she had ever seen gathered in one place. She spotted familiar faces, Lady Caroline looking sympathetic from across the room, several of her father's friends nodding politely, but their wives turning away with expressions of disapproval, and there against the far wall stood Edmund Whitmore, his face a mask of cold fury as he watched them enter. And Georgiana felt a chill run down her spine at the naked hatred in his eyes. Sebastian must have felt her tense because his hand covered hers again briefly. "Ignore him," he murmured. "He has no claim on you, and no right to his anger." The orchestra was already playing, couples whirling across the polished floor in a waltz that made Georgiana's stomach clench with nerves, because dancing with Sebastian in a crowded ballroom where every eye would be upon them was entirely different from the abstract idea of dancing she had agreed to in her father's library. Sebastian led her toward the floor with unhurried confidence, and as they took their positions, she was suddenly terrified that she would stumble, that her feet would not remember the steps, that she would humiliate both of them in front of the entire ton. "Look at me," Sebastian said quietly, his hand settling at her waist with firm gentleness. "Pretend we are the only two people here." She met his eyes and found herself anchored by the steadiness she saw there, and then the music swelled and they were moving, and she discovered that Sebastian Wentworth was an exquisite dancer, guiding her through the turns with such skill that she felt weightless, her feet following his lead without conscious thought as they swept across the floor. The whispers faded into background noise as she focused on his face, the strong lines of jaw and cheekbone, the grey eyes that held hers with unwavering attention. And gradually, she felt her terror transforming into something else, something almost like exhilaration as they moved together in perfect synchronization. "You dance beautifully," she said, surprised into honesty. I had not expected such grace from a man with a reputation for avoiding ballrooms. "I had excellent tutors," he replied, and then, after a pause, added with the hint of a smile, "And I find I am highly motivated to make a good impression on my partner this evening." Despite everything, despite the watching crowd and the weight of scandal and her own uncertainty about what she had agreed to, Georgiana felt a laugh bubble up in her chest and escape before she could contain it, and Sebastian's eyes brightened at the sound. "There," he said softly. "That is what I wanted to see." They completed the waltz, and he led her from the floor, and immediately claimed her hand for the next dance, a country reel that required less conversation but more concentration on the patterns. And through it all, Georgiana was intensely aware of the scrutiny they were under, the fans fluttering with whispered speculation, the way other dancers gave them slightly more space than was strictly necessary, as though scandal might be contagious. By their third dance together, another waltz, she had relaxed enough to feel bold. "Why have you never married?" she asked abruptly, deciding that if she was going to be the subject of gossip, she might as well use this arrangement to satisfy her own curiosity. "And do not deflect. You bought the right to my time. I am spending it however I choose." Sebastian looked startled for a moment, and then he laughed, a genuine sound of surprised pleasure that transformed his usually severe features into something almost boyish. "You are not what I expected, Miss Fairfax," he said. "Most women would not dare be so direct. Most women have not had their dance cards purchased for an entire season." She countered. "I think unusual circumstances permit unusual behavior." "Fair enough," he conceded, and his expression grew more serious as he guided her through a turn. "My father married my mother for her fortune. She was the daughter of a wealthy merchant, not quite accepted by the aristocracy but desperate to be, and my father needed money to restore the Ashford estates. He was unfailingly polite to her, never raised his voice or his hand, but he treated her with such cold indifference that it was worse than cruelty might have been. I watched her smile fade year by year, watched her become smaller and quieter until she was barely a shadow of the vibrant woman I remembered from my early childhood. When she died, I swore I would never trap another woman in such a marriage." Georgiana felt her throat tighten with sympathy at the raw pain in his voice, the way his jaw clenched as he spoke of memories that clearly still haunted him. "And yet you have caged yourself instead," she said softly. "Is that truly better?" Sebastian's eyes met hers with such intensity that she felt the impact physically. "I am beginning to wonder," he admitted. The honesty of his response made her heart race, and she found herself sharing her own wound in return, the words spilling out before she could reconsider. "My mother died when I was 10. An influenza epidemic swept through London, and she insisted on personally tending the sick on our estate, rather than leaving it to servants. She always said privilege carried responsibility. She caught the illness and was gone within a week. My father fell apart. He could not bear to be in our country house where everything reminded him of her. So we moved to London, and he threw himself into business ventures, investments, anything to distract himself from his grief. He made increasingly reckless choices, and when the railway schemes failed, he lost almost everything." Sebastian's hand tightened on hers. "I am sorry," he said simply. "You must have felt very alone." "I did," she admitted. "I still do, most of the time." Until now, the words were out before she could stop them. Too honest, too revealing, and she felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "Until now," Sebastian repeated quietly, and there was something in his voice that made her look up to find him watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher, but that made her pulse quicken. "We are both trying not to repeat our parents' mistakes," she observed, grateful for the distraction of analysis. "You by avoiding marriage entirely, me by being willing to accept a loveless match for financial security. Perhaps we are more alike than either of us realized." "Perhaps," Sebastian agreed, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand where he held it, a gesture she was not certain he was even aware of making. "Or perhaps we are learning that the patterns we thought were inevitable can actually be changed if we have the courage to try something different." The dance ended, but Sebastian did not immediately release her hand, and they stood for a moment in the middle of the floor, while other couples moved around them, caught in a bubble of awareness that made the crowded ballroom feel suddenly intimate. Then he seemed to recall where they were and stepped back with a slight bow, but his eyes never left her face as he asked if she would like refreshment or preferred to continue dancing. "I should like to dance," she said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. "I have not enjoyed a ball since I cannot remember when." The evening passed in a blur of waltzes and reels and polkas, Sebastian claiming every dance with the proprietary confidence of a man who had literally purchased the right to do so, and Georgiana found herself relaxing into the rhythm of it, the pleasure of moving with a partner who anticipated her every step, the unexpected joy of conversation that ranged from light teasing to deeper revelations about their lives and thoughts. She noticed other women watching them with undisguised envy, their eyes following Sebastian with the hunger of those who had pursued him for years without success, and she felt a forbidden pleasure at being the one on his arm, the one he smiled at with genuine warmth rather than polite distance. During a brief interval when Sebastian went to procure champagne, Lady Caroline materialized at Georgiana's side with eyes bright with curiosity. "My dear, you must tell me everything," she said in an urgent whisper. "The entire ballroom is talking about nothing but you and the Duke. Is it true he paid your father £50,000 merely for the right to dance with you?" Georgiana felt her cheeks warm. "I would prefer not to discuss the financial details, but yes, we have an arrangement for the season." Lady Caroline's expression softened. "And are you happy with this arrangement?" Georgiana considered the question, glancing across the room to where Sebastian stood speaking with the Duke of Somerset, his tall figure commanding attention even in a crowd of distinguished men. To her surprise, "I think I am," she said quietly. "Or at least, I am happier than I would have been accepting Lord Whitmore's suit." "That much is certain," Lady Caroline agreed with feeling. "Whitmore has been poisoning every ear he can find with suggestions that you and Ashford are engaged in something scandalous. But I notice you are smiling more tonight than I have seen in months, so I think perhaps the scandal is worth it." Sebastian returned with champagne, and Lady Caroline excused herself with a meaningful look, and as Georgiana sipped the cool sparkling wine, she felt some of her remaining tension dissolve. The ballroom had grown warmer as the evening progressed, the combined heat of hundreds of bodies and thousands of candles making the air thick and fragrant with mingled perfumes and the scent of hothouse flowers that filled every available surface. Through the tall windows she could see the formal gardens lit by lanterns, and beyond them the full moon rising over the estate, casting silver light across the manicured lawns. They danced again and again, and somewhere during their 7th or 8th turn around the floor, Georgiana realized that she had stopped counting the dances, stopped worrying about the watching crowd, stopped thinking about anything except the man guiding her through the steps with such focused attention that she felt like the only woman in the world. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, as the orchestra began what she knew would be the final waltz of the evening. "I have not enjoyed myself this much in longer than I can remember." "Sebastian," he corrected gently. "When we are dancing, call me Sebastian." The intimacy of using his given name made her breath catch, but she tried it tentatively. "Sebastian." His eyes darkened at the sound of his name on her lips, and his hand tightened at her waist. "Yes," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Just like that." They danced the final waltz in silence, but it was a comfortable quiet, weighted with awareness and the sense of something shifting between them, some barrier beginning to crack. When the music ended, and Sebastian finally, reluctantly released her, Georgiana felt the loss of his touch like a physical ache. The crowd began to disperse, guests calling for their carriages, the spell of the evening beginning to break, and Sebastian offered his arm to escort her out into the soft summer night. A light rain had begun to fall, while they were inside, barely more than mist, and the air smelled clean and fresh after the oppressive heat of the ballroom. They waited under the portico for his carriage to be brought round, and Georgiana was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the solid warmth of him, the way he angled his body slightly to shield her from the damp breeze. I meant what I said earlier, Sebastian told her quietly. I am the luckiest man in London, not because of my title or fortune, but because I get to spend my evenings dancing with you. Georgiana looked up at him, this complicated man who had charged into her life with an outrageous proposal and somehow given her the first genuine happiness she had felt in years. I think perhaps we are both lucky, she said softly, to have found each other, even under such unusual circumstances. His carriage arrived, and he handed her up with careful courtesy, settling beside her for the short ride back to her father's house. And as they rolled through the rain-slicked streets of London, Georgiana felt something warm unfurling in her chest, something that might have been hope, or might have been the first tentative stirrings of an emotion she was not quite ready to name. Sebastian walked her to her door, and in the shadowed privacy of the entrance, he took her hand and raised it to his lips, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her pulse race. "Sleep well, Georgiana," he said, and the sound of her name in his deep voice sent shivers down her spine. "I shall call tomorrow to discuss our next engagement." She watched from the window of her room as his carriage disappeared into the misty night, and when she finally turned away, she caught sight of her reflection in the looking-glass and was startled by what she saw. The woman staring back at her was flushed and bright-eyed, her lips curved in a smile she had not consciously put there, and she looked alive in a way she had not looked in years, as though something that had been dormant within her had suddenly awakened. Across London in his Mayfair townhouse, Sebastian dismissed his valet and stood at the window of his study, staring out at the rain without really seeing it, his mind full of amber eyes and spontaneous laughter, and the way Georgiana had felt in his arms as they danced, so perfectly matched to his movements that it was as though they had been dancing together for years rather than hours. He had told himself this arrangement was about giving her choice, about preventing her from being trapped as his mother had been trapped, and those things were true. But he was beginning to suspect there was another truth beneath the noble justification, that from the moment he had seen her across Lady Hertford's ballroom, with resignation in her eyes and grace in her bearing, despite the humiliation she was enduring, something in him had recognized something in her, a kindred spirit, a fellow survivor of parents' mistakes, someone who might understand the walls he had built, and why he had built them. He poured himself a brandy he had no intention of drinking, and acknowledged what he had been trying to ignore since signing those papers in Lord Fairfax's study, that the arrangement he had presented as temporary and practical was already becoming something else entirely, something dangerous and wonderful and terrifying, and that 3 months might not be nearly enough time to satisfy the hunger he felt building in his chest every time Georgiana smiled at him. The rain intensified, drumming against the windows in a rhythm that matched his racing thoughts, and Sebastian stood alone in his study and wondered what madness had possessed him to think he could spend an entire season in Georgiana Fairfax's company without falling completely and irrevocably in love with her, and whether perhaps that had been his intention all along, hidden even from himself until it was too late to retreat. In her bedchamber, Georgiana lay awake and stared at the ceiling, reliving every moment of the evening, every word exchanged, every touch of Sebastian's hand on hers, and she tried to tell herself that the warmth spreading through her chest was simply gratitude for being rescued from Edmund's presumptuous suit. But she knew she was lying to herself, knew that what she felt when she looked into Sebastian's grey eyes and saw them soften as he watched her laugh was something far more dangerous than gratitude, something she had promised herself she would not allow because their arrangement had an expiration date, and she could not afford to lose her heart to a man who had made it clear he had no intention of marrying anyone. But as sleep finally claimed her, and her dreams filled with the memory of strong arms guiding her through a waltz and a deep voice calling her beautiful, Georgiana had to admit that it might already be too late for such sensible precautions, that the walls around her own heart were crumbling just as surely as Sebastian's were, and that whatever happened at the end of the season, she was already far more invested in this arrangement than simple self-preservation would recommend. The 3 weeks following the Duchess of Somerset's ball had passed in a blur of social engagements and stolen conversations, and Georgiana had discovered that happiness was not the quiet contentment she had always imagined, but rather a bright, fizzing sensation that made her feel perpetually breathless, as though she were standing on the edge of something vast and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Sebastian called for her nearly every evening, their routine now familiar to the point of comfort, his carriage arriving promptly at the appointed hour, his hand steady as he helped her ascend, the way his eyes would find hers across crowded ballrooms, with a look that made her pulse race no matter how many times she saw it. They had danced at Lady Pembroke's musicale and the Earl of Devonshire's ball and countless other gatherings where London society watched, their every interaction with fascination that ranged from romantic approval to scandalized disapproval. But Georgiana found she cared less and less what others thought as she grew more certain of what she herself felt, which was that Sebastian Wentworth had somehow become the most important person in her world, and the thought of the season ending and their arrangement dissolving filled her with a dread she tried desperately not to examine too closely. They talked during their dances, really talked in a way Georgiana had never experienced with another person, Sebastian sharing stories of his childhood at the Ashford estate and his years in India with the army, though she noticed he always stopped short of discussing why he had left military service, a shadow crossing his face whenever the topic approached that particular territory. She in turn told him about her mother's charity work and her own love of reading and the dreams she had harbored as a girl of traveling to Italy and Greece, dreams sometimes that had seemed impossibly distant when her only future appeared to be marriage to Edmund Whitmore, but that now felt tantalizingly possible again, as though Sebastian's intervention had opened doors she had thought permanently closed. London society remained divided on the propriety of their arrangement, the older matrons generally disapproving while younger people found it thrillingly romantic, and the gossip columns had taken to calling them the Duke and his dancing partner, with a mixture of amusement and speculation about whether the season would end in marriage or scandal. Edmund Whitmore had withdrawn from society after his humiliation, at least that was what Georgiana had heard from Lady Caroline, and she had felt only relief at not having to face his cold fury across crowded rooms, though sometimes she caught herself wondering if his absence was merely the calm before a storm. The Marquis of Blackwood's garden party arrived on a perfect June afternoon, the kind of day that seemed designed for pleasure, with cloudless blue skies and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of roses and freshly cut grass across the expansive lawns that sloped down toward the Thames. The estate in Richmond was one of the loveliest in England, its formal gardens giving way to natural parkland where deer grazed beneath ancient oaks, and white pavilions had been erected on the lawn to provide shade for the 200 guests who had been invited to what promised to be the social event of the week. Georgiana wore a new dress of pale pink muslin with delicate embroidery at the hem and sleeves, and when Sebastian called for her that afternoon, his eyes had darkened with appreciation in a way that made her feel beautiful and desired in ways she had never experienced before. The party was well underway when they arrived, ladies with parasols strolling along the garden paths, while gentlemen engaged in lawn bowling and archery, refreshment tables laden with iced champagne and delicate pastries, the whole scene one of elegant leisure that represented English society at its most refined. Sebastian secured them glasses of champagne, and they wandered toward the river, where the willow trees provided dappled shade, and the sound of water over stones created a peaceful backdrop, and Georgiana felt herself relaxing into the afternoon with the easy contentment that had become familiar whenever she was in Sebastian's company. They were standing near one of the refreshment pavilions, laughing over something Sebastian had said about the Duchess of Marlborough's truly spectacular hat, when Georgiana noticed a commotion near the main lawn, voices rising in a way that suggested something more dramatic than the usual polite garden party conversation. Sebastian noticed it too, his expression shifting from relaxed amusement to wary attention, and then the crowd seemed to part, and Edmund Whitmore strode through, his face set with grim determination and a leather portfolio clutched in his hand. Georgiana felt her stomach drop, some instinct warning her that whatever was about to happen would shatter the fragile happiness of the past 3 weeks, and she moved closer to Sebastian without conscious thought, seeking the protection of his presence even as she watched Edmund approach with the focused intensity of a man on a mission. "Ladies and gentlemen," Edmund announced loudly, his voice carrying across the lawn and causing conversations to halt mid-sentence as heads turned toward him with the avid curiosity of those who sensed impending scandal. "I apologize for interrupting these pleasant festivities, but I have information of such importance regarding one of our company that I felt duty-bound to share it immediately in the interest of protecting the innocent from harm." Sebastian had gone very still beside her, his expression shifting from wary to blank in the space of a heartbeat, and Georgiana felt cold dread spreading through her chest as Edmund's eyes found hers with something that might have been concern or might have been triumph. She could not tell which. "I have here letters," Edmund continued, raising the portfolio for all to see. "Correspondence from Sebastian Wentworth's time serving in India with the military, which detail a most disturbing scandal involving the wife of his superior officer." He opened the portfolio with theatrical precision and withdrew several sheets of paper, his voice taking on the cadence of a prosecutor as he began to read. Lieutenant Sebastian Wentworth was observed multiple times in the company of Mrs. Catherine Whitley, wife of Colonel James Whitley, in circumstances most compromising to her reputation and his honor. The gasps that rippled through the assembled guests seemed to suck all the air from the garden, and Georgiana stared at Edmund in horrified disbelief as he continued reading, his voice growing stronger with each damning phrase. The colonel's subsequent despair at his wife's infidelity and Lieutenant Wentworth's betrayal of his trust led to tragic consequences, culminating in Colonel Whitley's death by his own hand and Lieutenant Wentworth's hasty resignation from military service. A resignation which speaks eloquently to his guilt in this sordid affair. Georgiana turned to look at Sebastian, desperate for him to deny the accusations, to explain, to do something other than stand there with his face drained of color and his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. But he said nothing, made no move to defend himself, and his silence seemed to confirm every terrible thing Edmund had just implied. "The Duke of Ashford is no honorable gentleman," Edmund declared, his eyes burning with righteous fury as he addressed Georgiana directly. "He destroys lives and walks away, leaving ruin in his wake. Miss Fairfax, I am trying to save you from making a terrible mistake. This man will destroy you as he has destroyed everyone who has trusted him, just as he destroyed Colonel Whitley and left his widow to face scandal and shame alone." The crowd erupted into shocked whispers, fans fluttering with agitation as ladies pressed closer to hear better, and gentlemen exchanged meaningful glances that suggested they had suspected something of this nature all along. Georgiana felt the world tilting around her, the beautiful garden suddenly oppressive, the faces of people she had known for years twisted with judgment and speculation. And through it all, Sebastian remained silent, his expression carefully blank in a way that made him look guilty, made him look like exactly the kind of man Edmund was describing. "This is the man who has bought your company for the season," Edmund continued, his voice softening with what seemed like genuine concern. "A man who cannot commit to anything or anyone without destroying it. I beg you to reconsider your arrangement before he ruins you as thoroughly as he has ruined everyone else who made the mistake of trusting him." Georgiana could not breathe, could not think, the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her as she stood frozen beside a man she had thought she was beginning to know, beginning to love, only to discover that perhaps she knew nothing at all. She looked at Sebastian again, willing him to speak, to explain, to give her any reason to disbelieve what Edmund had just revealed. But he only met her gaze with something that looked heartbreakingly like resignation, as though he had been expecting this moment and had already accepted its inevitability. "I need," she started, her voice barely audible over the rising buzz of speculation. "I need a moment, please." She turned and fled before anyone could stop her, gathering her skirts and running across the lawn toward the river. Her vision blurring with tears, she refused to let fall until she was away from the crowd, away from the judgment and the whispers and the terrible expression on Sebastian's face that had looked like guilt and shame and defeat all tangled together. She found herself in a small grove of willow trees near the water's edge, the long branches hanging low to create a natural curtain that provided blessed privacy, and she collapsed onto a stone bench and finally let herself cry. Great shaking sobs that came from somewhere deep in her chest, where hope had been building for 3 weeks only to be shattered in the space of 5 minutes. The sound of footsteps on grass made her look up, and Sebastian stood at the edge of the grove, his face still that terrible mask of blank composure that revealed nothing and somehow revealed everything. "Georgiana," he said quietly, "please let me explain." She stood, anger rising to replace the grief, because anger was easier, safer than acknowledging the pain of betrayal. "Explain what?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Explain that everything Edmund said is true. That you seduced a married woman and drove her husband to suicide. That you fled India rather than face the consequences of your actions. Your silence back there was explanation enough." Sebastian flinched as though she had struck him. "It is not that simple," he said, his voice rough with emotion he was clearly struggling to contain. "The truth is far more complicated than Whitmore's version, but I cannot defend myself without making things worse, without hurting someone who has already suffered more than anyone should have to bear." "Then tell me," Georgiana said desperately. "Tell me the truth, all of it, not the version that protects me, but the real truth. Because right now I do not know what to believe or who to trust, or whether the past 3 weeks have been built on lies." Sebastian moved closer, his hands clenched at his sides as though he did not trust himself to reach for her. "Colonel James Whitley was my commanding officer in India," he began, each word seeming to cost him. "He was well respected, connected to powerful families, everything a military man should be. But he was also a monster who beat his wife behind closed doors, who used his rank and position to ensure no one questioned him." When she appeared with bruises, she explained away as clumsiness. His voice cracked slightly, and he paused to gather himself before continuing. "I discovered the truth by accident, came upon him striking her in their quarters when I arrived early for a meeting. I reported it to my superiors, believing they would take action, but they covered it up, said that marital matters were private and that Whitley's service record was too valuable to risk over domestic discord." Georgiana felt her anger wavering as she watched the pain in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "What happened then?" she asked more gently. "I could not serve under a man I knew to be an abuser, could not stand by while the system protected him and condemned her to continued suffering." Sebastian said, "I told Mrs. Whitley that I would help her leave if she wished it, that I had family connections who could provide her safe refuge. We met several times to discuss arrangements, always in public places, but not public enough, apparently, because rumors started. Someone saw us talking in the regimental gardens, saw me hand her a letter containing information about where she could go, and they assumed the worst." He turned away, staring at the river as though he could not bear to meet her eyes. Colonel Whitley heard the rumors and confronted his wife. She told him she was leaving, that she could not endure his cruelty any longer. That night he took his own life, and the next morning the official inquiry began. They had those letters Edmund read today, evidence of my meetings with Mrs. Whitley, and they were preparing to court-martial me for conduct unbecoming an officer. But Mrs. Whitley came to me before the inquiry could proceed. She was devastated, blaming herself for her husband's death, and she begged me not to defend myself by revealing what he had done to her. She said she could not bear to have her private shame made public, that society would blame her anyway, and that if I truly wanted to help her, the best thing I could do was resign quietly and let the scandal die. So I did. Sebastian turned back to face Georgiana, his expression raw with emotions he no longer tried to hide. I resigned my commission and left India, and the inquiry was quietly buried because neither side wanted the truth to come out. Mrs. Whitley was able to return to England and eventually remarried to a good man who treats her with the kindness she deserves. She has found happiness and peace, and I will not destroy that by defending myself now. Let them think what they will of me, but I will not drag her through scandal again. Georgiana felt tears streaming down her face as she listened, understanding now the impossible position he had been in, the choice between his own honor and protecting a woman who had already suffered so much. "I believe you," she whispered, "but they will not, will they? The Ton will believe Edmund's version because it is simpler, more scandalous, and because you will not defend yourself." Sebastian moved closer, his hand reaching out as though to touch her face before dropping back to his side. "I knew this would surface eventually," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "I should never have dragged you into my life. You were right to be suspicious of my motives, right to question why I made that offer. Perhaps I was selfish. Perhaps I wanted something for myself even knowing it could not last." His grey eyes held hers with devastating honesty. "You are free of our arrangement, Georgiana. Go. Save yourself. Walk away before my scandal destroys your reputation entirely." She stared at him, seeing in his face the same look her mother must have worn when she chose to tend the sick, knowing it might cost her life, the look of someone willing to sacrifice themselves for another's well-being. "And if I do not want to be saved?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of the river. "If I want to stay." Sebastian's expression crumbled for just a moment before he forced it back to careful control. "Do not," he said desperately. "Do not sacrifice your future for me. I am not worth it." "Should I not be the judge of that?" Georgiana challenged, anger rising again, but this time directed at his self-recrimination rather than at him. "You have spent 3 weeks telling me I have the right to choose my own path, to make my own decisions. Do not take that away from me now by deciding what I can and cannot risk." "But this is different," Sebastian argued. "This is not about whether you prefer Whitmore or another suitor. This is about whether you are willing to be branded as the mistress of a man accused of driving another to suicide, to have your name connected to scandal that will follow you for the rest of your life." "Yes," Georgiana said quietly. "It is about exactly that. And it is my choice to make, not yours." They stood facing each other in the dappled shade of the willow grove, the sound of the garden party continuing in the distance, laughter and music carrying on as though the world had not just shifted irrevocably. Georgiana could hear the whispers that would already be spreading through the crowd, the speculation about where she and Sebastian had disappeared to, the assumptions that Edmund's revelations would be taken as confirmed truth by her failure to immediately denounce Sebastian and return to the party on Edmund's arm. "If I stand by you," she said slowly, thinking through the implications, "I will be ruined by association. The Ton will assume the worst, will say I am either your mistress or a fool, and no respectable man will want me after this season ends." Sebastian's face was anguished. "Yes," he confirmed, "that is exactly what will happen. And if I walk away, return to the party and accept Edmund's suit, I salvage my reputation and secure my father's financial future," Georgiana continued. "I would be safe, respectable, everything I was raised to be." Sebastian nodded, his throat working as he swallowed hard. "I would not blame you," he said hoarsely. "I would understand completely." Georgiana looked at him, this complicated man who had charged into her life with an outrageous proposal and somehow given her 3 weeks of genuine happiness, who had shared his deepest wounds with her and listened to hers in return, who had made her laugh and made her feel seen in ways she had never experienced before. She thought of Edmund's cold triumph as he read those letters, the way he had framed his revelation as concern for her well-being when it was clearly motivated by wounded pride and jealousy. And she realized that whatever Sebastian's flaws, whatever mistakes he had made, his fundamental character was decent in a way Edmund's would never be. But then she thought of her father, already counting on the settlement Sebastian had paid, the relief in Lord Fairfax's eyes when he believed their financial troubles were over, and she thought of the vicious whispers that would follow her if she chose to stay, the doors that would close, the future that would narrow to almost nothing. "I need time," she said finally. "I need to think, to understand what I am choosing and what it will cost." Sebastian nodded, his expression shuttered again. "Of course," he said formally. "I will escort you home, and you may send word when you have made your decision." They walked back through the gardens in silence, and Georgiana was acutely aware of the eyes following them, the whispers that died when they passed only to resume with renewed vigor behind their backs. Edmund stood near the main pavilion, surrounded by a knot of sympathetic listeners, and he met Georgiana's gaze with something that might have been concern or might have been satisfaction. She could not tell which, and found she no longer cared. The ride back to London passed in uncomfortable silence, Georgiana staring out the window while her mind spun in circles, weighing duty against desire, security against happiness, the safe path against the uncertain one. Sebastian sat across from her, his face carefully blank, and she wondered if he was already preparing himself for her rejection, already building back the walls that 3 weeks of dancing had begun to erode. When they arrived at her father's house, Sebastian helped her descend from the carriage with the same careful courtesy he had always shown, but he did not meet her eyes as he bowed formally and said, "I await your decision, Miss Fairfax," the return to her formal name feeling like a door closing between them. Georgiana stood on the steps and watched his carriage roll away, and then she turned and entered the house to find her father waiting in the entrance hall with an expression of confusion and concern. "My dear, what has happened?" Lord Fairfax asked. "Lady Pemberton sent a note saying there was some disturbance at the garden party." Georgiana looked at her father, this kind man who had tried his best after losing the love of his life, and had made mistakes born of grief and desperation rather than malice, and she knew she could not explain without breaking down completely. "Later, Papa," she said quietly. "I need to think." She retreated to her room and dismissed her maid, and sat at her window staring out at the London rooftops while the sun slowly set and shadows lengthened across the city. Somewhere out there, Sebastian was probably in his study, alone with his brandy and his ghosts, assuming she would choose safety over him, because why would anyone choose differently? And somewhere out there, Edmund was celebrating his victory, convinced he had rescued her from ruin when in fact he had only revealed his own cruel nature. The choice before her was impossible, both paths leading to loss, one offering security and respectability at the cost of happiness, the other offering love and partnership at the cost of everything else. But as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Georgiana found herself thinking about her mother, who had chosen to help others even knowing it might cost her life, who had always said that privilege carried responsibility, but also that life was too short to live by fear alone. She thought about the past 3 weeks, the way Sebastian had made her feel valued and seen, the conversations that had ranged from silly to profound, the way her heart had lifted every time his carriage arrived to collect her for another evening of dancing. And she thought about the rest of her life, decades stretching ahead, and tried to imagine living them without ever feeling that way again, without ever being truly seen by another person, trapped in a respectable marriage to a man who viewed her as property rather than partner. The choice was impossible, but as midnight approached and London settled into uneasy sleep around her, Georgiana realized that perhaps some choices were worth making, even when they cost everything, that perhaps her mother had been right about living without fear, and that she would rather face scandal with Sebastian than security with Edmund. would rather be ruined for loving the wrong man than respected for accepting the right one. She did not know yet how she would tell her father, or how she would face society's judgment, or what would happen when the season ended and their arrangement expired, leaving her with no protection and no prospects. She knew only that tomorrow she would send word to Sebastian that she was staying, that she chose him despite everything, and that whatever consequences followed were hers to bear, chosen freely rather than accepted with resignation, and that somehow that made all the difference. The 2 days following the garden party disaster passed with agonizing slowness, each hour stretching into an eternity as Georgiana sat in her room and wrestled with the impossible decision before her, barely eating, hardly sleeping, her mind spinning through endless calculations of duty and desire, security and love, the safe path and the uncertain one. Lord Fairfax had tried repeatedly to speak with her, his face creased with worry as he hovered outside her door, asking if she was ill, if she needed anything, if perhaps she would like to discuss whatever had happened at the Marquis of Blackwood's garden party, but she had sent him away each time with gentle insistence that she needed solitude to think. The entire city seemed to be holding its breath waiting for her decision, and she knew from the notes that arrived hourly that society had already divided into camps, some convinced she would do the sensible thing and accept Edmund's renewed suit, which he had formally offered through her father the morning after the garden party, others speculating that the Duke of Ashford's scandal had destroyed any chance of a respectable match for her, and she would be forced to retire to the country in disgrace. Lady Caroline had called twice, full of concerned questions and offers of support, and even her aunt had written from the countryside urging her to think carefully about throwing away her future for a man whose past was so clouded with suspicion, well-meaning advice that only made Georgiana's chest ache with the weight of expectation and judgment. She had spent hours staring out her window at the London rooftops, watching the city carry on with its daily business while her entire world hung in balance. And she had thought about her mother more in those 2 days than she had in years, remembering the stories her father used to tell about the woman who had chosen principle over safety, who had believed that privilege carried responsibility, and that life was too precious to live in fear. On the afternoon of the second day, as shadows lengthened across her room and the sounds of evening began to drift up from the street below, Georgiana finally allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she had been circling since the moment Sebastian had offered to release her from their arrangement, which was that she loved him with a certainty that transcended logic or practicality, loved him for his honor and his vulnerability and the way he had given her choice when no one else had, and that she would rather face scandal and ruin with him than security and respectability with anyone else. The realization brought a strange calm, the clarity of a decision made despite its cost, and she rose from her window seat and went to her writing desk, where she composed 2 letters, one to Sebastian telling him that she had made her choice and asking him to meet her at the Royal Charity Ball the following evening, and one to her father explaining as gently as she could that she would not be accepting Edmund Whitmore's suit and that she understood if this disappointed him, but hoped he would eventually understand that she needed to choose her own path, even if it led somewhere unexpected. Lord Fairfax had received her letter with visible distress, his hands trembling as he read her words, and then he had looked at her with eyes that held both worry and something that might have been pride, as he asked if she was certain, truly certain, because once this choice was made, there would be no going back. She had nodded, her throat too tight for words, and he had embraced her with the fierce protectiveness of a father who wanted to shield his daughter from pain, but understood that some lessons could only be learned through living them. The letter to Sebastian she had sent by private messenger, with instructions that it be delivered directly into the Duke's hands, but the messenger had returned with word that the Duke of Ashford had left London 2 days prior for his estate in Kent, and was not expected to return for the remainder of the season, and Georgiana had felt her carefully constructed resolve waver at the realization that Sebastian had already given up, had already assumed she would choose safety over him, and had retreated to lick his wounds in private. But Lord Fairfax, when she had told him of Sebastian's departure with poorly concealed devastation, had surprised her by placing a gentle hand on her shoulder and saying that perhaps the Duke simply needed to be shown that someone was willing to fight for him the way he had fought for her. And then her father had done something that made Georgiana's eyes fill with tears, which was to take the letter she had written to Sebastian and promise to send it by the fastest rider he could hire, with instructions to deliver it to Kent and await a response. The Royal Charity Ball was the most prestigious event of the entire social season, held in the staterooms of Buckingham Palace with minor royalty in attendance and guest lists so exclusive that invitations were considered marks of the highest social standing, and Georgiana had never expected to attend until Sebastian's arrangement with her father had elevated her status enough to warrant inclusion. Now, as her carriage rolled through the palace gates on the evening of the third day, she felt terror and determination warring in her chest, her hands trembling as she smoothed the skirts of her gown, a creation of ivory silk with silver embroidery that caught the light and made her feel like she was wearing starlight itself. Her father sat across from her in the carriage, his face grave but supportive, and he had insisted on accompanying her, despite her protests that his presence might make things more difficult, saying firmly that he would not allow his daughter to face London society's judgment alone. The palace was ablaze with light, every window glowing golden against the darkening sky, and as they joined the river of carriages disgorging guests at the grand entrance, Georgiana caught glimpses of the most distinguished members of the aristocracy, duchesses dripping with diamonds and earls in formal court dress, the kind of gathering where a single misstep could ruin a reputation forever. They entered through doors held by liveried footmen into a reception hall of almost intimidating grandeur, marble floors polished to mirror brightness and walls hung with priceless tapestries, and then they were being announced by a majordomo whose voice rang out across the massive ballroom. Miss Georgiana Fairfax and Lord Fairfax, and Georgiana felt every eye in the room turn toward her with the weight of judgment and speculation. The ballroom was even more magnificent than she had imagined, gilded ceilings soaring overhead with chandeliers so massive they seemed to hold entire galaxies of crystals, mirrors lining the walls to multiply the crowd of perhaps 600 guests into seeming thousands, and an orchestra of 40 musicians playing from a raised platform at one end. The atmosphere was oppressively formal, everyone on their absolute best behavior in the presence of minor royalty, conversations conducted in hushed tones and movements governed by the strict protocols that ruled such events. Georgiana descended the stairs into the ballroom with her head high and her spine straight, drawing on every lesson in deportment she had ever received, and she was acutely aware of the whispers that followed her progress, fans fluttering with barely concealed excitement as people noted her arrival without the Duke of Ashford at her side. She scanned the crowd desperately for any sign of Sebastian, hoping against hope that he had received her father's message and ridden back to London, but he was nowhere to be seen, and her heart sank even as she forced herself to continue walking toward the center of the ballroom. Edmund Whitmore stood near one of the refreshment tables, surrounded by sympathetic listeners, his expression shifting from surprise to satisfaction as he saw her, clearly interpreting her solo arrival as confirmation that she had come to her senses and would accept his suit. Lady Caroline appeared at her elbow with eyes wide with concern, whispering urgent questions about whether Georgiana knew what she was doing and whether the Duke was coming, and Georgiana could only shake her head and whisper back that she was doing what needed to be done, regardless of whether Sebastian appeared or not. The ballroom had grown quieter as people noticed her presence and began to realize that something significant was about to happen. Conversations dying mid-sentence as attention focused on the young woman who stood alone at the center of the polished floor, and Georgiana felt her pulse racing so fast she thought she might faint. but she forced herself to breathe slowly and remember why she was here, what she needed to say, the truth she needed to speak regardless of its cost. She raised her voice and was surprised by how steady it sounded, how clearly it carried across the hushed ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, and the remaining conversation ceased entirely as 600 people turned to stare at her with varying expressions of shock and fascination and disapproval. "I apologize for this breach of protocol, but I have something to say that cannot wait for a more convenient moment." She paused, gathering her courage, and then continued with growing strength. "We are quick to believe scandal and slow to recognize honor. We protect reputations while destroying character, and we judge others based on whispers and rumors rather than evidence or truth. I have spent this season with a man society has judged without knowing him, condemned without hearing his side of events that were far more complicated than simple scandal would suggest." Some gasps rippled through the crowd, but Georgiana pressed on, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I have seen the Duke of Ashford's character firsthand through weeks of conversation and companionship. I have seen his honor in how he treats those weaker than himself, his integrity in how he refuses to defend himself at another's expense, his kindness in how he gave me something no one else thought to offer, which was choice. Whatever my decision costs me in terms of reputation or social standing, it is mine to make freely, and I choose to stand by a man whose worst crime was protecting someone who had already suffered enough." The ballroom had erupted in whispers now, some shocked, some moved, fans fluttering madly as ladies pressed hands to hearts and gentlemen exchanged meaningful glances. But Georgiana was not finished. "I am proud to have spent this season dancing with the Duke of Ashford," she declared, her eyes sweeping the crowd with a defiance she had not known she possessed. "And I intend to continue doing so for the rest of this season and beyond, if he will have me." The statement was as close to a public declaration of love as a woman could make without completely destroying every shred of propriety, and the reaction was immediate and dramatic, some people gasping in shock, while others began applauding tentatively. The younger set clearly thrilled by the romance of it, while older matrons looked scandalized. Edmund pushed through the crowd toward her, his face flushed with fury, and what might have been genuine concern twisted into something ugly by wounded pride. "You are throwing away your reputation, your future, for a man who has abandoned you," he said loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "The Duke of Ashford is not even here to defend you or stand by your side. What does that tell you about his character, Miss Fairfax?" Georgiana turned to face him with a calm she did not feel, her voice quiet but carrying clearly in the hushed ballroom. "It tells me that he believed I had chosen safety over him, which is what any reasonable person would have done. But I have never been particularly reasonable, Lord Whitmore, and I do not need him to defend me because I am quite capable of standing on my own." Edmund's expression crumbled slightly, confusion and hurt warring with anger. "I tried to save you," he said, his voice dropping to something almost pleading. "I exposed Ashford's scandal to protect you from making a terrible mistake." "You protected your own wounded pride," Georgiana replied gently but firmly. "You exposed a man's deepest pain not out of concern for me, but because you could not bear that I preferred his company to yours. There is a difference between protection and possession, Lord Whitmore, and you have never understood which you were offering me." The ballroom had gone absolutely silent now, everyone straining to hear this very public confrontation, and Georgiana was aware of minor royalty watching from the far end of the room with expressions ranging from shock to fascination. Edmund opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the massive doors at the entrance to the ballroom swung open with enough force to bang against the walls, and every head turned to see Sebastian Wentworth, Duke of Ashford, standing in the doorway in riding clothes covered with dust from hard travel, his hair dishevelled and his cravat askew, completely and utterly improper for a royal event, but somehow more commanding than any man in formal court dress. Georgiana felt her heart stop and then restart at double speed as Sebastian's eyes found hers across the crowded ballroom, and she saw in his face exhaustion and determination, and something that looked like desperate hope as he began walking toward her, the crowd parting before him like water before a ship's prow. "Forgive my appearance," Sebastian said as he approached, his voice rough from cold and fatigue, but carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. "I have been riding since dawn, and could not take time to change when Lord Fairfax's message reached me at my estate in Kent." He stopped directly in front of Georgiana, close enough that she could see the lines of strain around his eyes, the evidence of sleepless nights and hard riding, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached for hers. "Miss Fairfax showed me that some things are worth the risk," he said, addressing not just Georgiana, but the entire assembled company. "Worth facing scandal, worth breaking vows I made to myself years ago, worth believing in despite every reason not to." His eyes held hers with devastating intensity. "You stood for me when I could not stand for myself. You saw me when I was hiding behind walls of propriety and pride. You chose me when I gave you every reason to choose safety instead." Georgiana felt tears streaming down her face, but she did not care who saw, her voice breaking as she replied, "You gave me choice when everyone else wanted to own me. You treated me as an equal when society saw me as a commodity. How could I not love you for that?" The gasps that rippled through the ballroom were audible, but Sebastian seemed not to hear them, his focus entirely on Georgiana as he slowly, deliberately went down on one knee in the center of the polished floor, still holding her hands in his. "Georgiana Fairfax," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed ballroom. "I am done hiding from life. I am done letting fear of becoming my father prevent me from living. I am done pretending that I do not need anyone, when the truth is that I need you more than I have ever needed anything in my life. Will you marry me?" The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath, 600 people frozen in anticipation, and Georgiana looked down at this proud man kneeling before her in dusty riding clothes in the most formal venue in England, making himself vulnerable in the most public way possible, and she felt something unlock in her chest that had been caged for so long she had forgotten what freedom felt like. "Yes?" she said, her voice ringing clear and strong. "But only if we are equals in this. I will not be owned, not even by you." Sebastian stood, pulling her into his arms with a laugh that was half relief and half joy. "You have owned me since the moment I saw you at Lady Hertford's ball," he said, his forehead resting against hers. "I am simply asking to make it official." "Then yes," Georgiana said again. "Yes, I will. I marry you." Sebastian kissed her then, a kiss that was tender and passionate and completely scandalous for such a public venue, and the ballroom erupted into chaos, some people gasping in shock while others began applauding, younger guests cheering openly while older matrons fanned themselves with expressions ranging from disapproval to secret delight. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and laughing, Georgiana was aware of the stares and whispers, but found she no longer cared, that the weight of society's judgment that had pressed down on her for so long had somehow lifted, leaving her feeling light and free and wonderfully alive. Lord Fairfax had tears streaming down his face as he approached to embrace his daughter, whispering that her mother would have been so proud of her courage, and Lady Caroline was openly weeping as she hugged Georgiana and declared it the most romantic thing she had ever witnessed. Edmund Whitmore had disappeared into the crowd, his face a study in defeat and confusion, and Georgiana felt a moment of pity for him before deciding that he would survive this blow to his pride, just as she had survived far worse. The Duke and Duchess of Pembroke approached to offer tentative congratulations, their presence lending social weight that would help smooth Georgiana and Sebastian's path back into society's good graces, and gradually others followed, the younger set enthusiastically, older guests more cautiously, but all acknowledging that whatever scandal surrounded the match, the obvious love between the couple made it somehow acceptable. Sebastian kept his arm around Georgiana's waist, protective and possessive, but in a way that felt like partnership rather than ownership. And when the orchestra struck up a waltz, he led her onto the floor with a smile that transformed his usually severe features into something almost boyish. "I believe this dance is mine," he said, as they began to move together with the perfect synchronization they had developed over weeks of practice. "All of them are," Georgiana replied, resting her head against his shoulder in a gesture that would have been scandalous before their engagement, but now felt like the most natural thing in the world. For the rest of this season, and every season after. They danced while the ballroom gradually resumed its festivities around them, some guests still scandalized, but others clearly charmed by the romance of it all, and Georgiana realized that she no longer cared which camp people fell into because their opinions no longer had power over her choices. She had spoken her truth and claimed her future and the man she loved, and whatever consequences followed were hers to face with Sebastian by her side. "On one condition," she said suddenly, pulling back to look up at him. "We face everything together from now on. No more protecting me by shutting me out, no more sacrificing yourself without letting me have a say. We are partners or we are nothing." Sebastian's eyes softened with emotion that made her breath catch. "I promise," he said solemnly. "No more walls, no more secrets, no more trying to shoulder burdens alone. We face everything together as equals." Georgiana smiled, the genuine, unguarded smile he had been trying to earn since the first night they danced, and she saw his expression shift to something almost like awe as he looked at her. "There it is," he murmured. "That smile. I would face any scandal, any judgment, any cost for the privilege of seeing that smile every day for the rest of my life." "Then you had better get used to it," Georgiana said, laughing as he spun her through a turn. "Because I intend to smile quite frequently now that I have something genuine to smile about." The ball continued around them, the initial shock of their public engagement giving way to celebration as the champagne flowed and the orchestra played on, and by the time the evening ended, Georgiana and Sebastian had danced every dance together, their happiness evident in every glance and touch and shared laugh. As they finally prepared to leave, Sebastian's carriage waiting to take them to her father's house, where propriety demanded he deliver her despite their engagement, Georgiana looked back at the glittering ballroom one final time and marveled at how completely her life had changed in the space of a single season. She had entered the social whirl as a desperate young woman resigned to accepting whatever match would save her family from ruin, and she was leaving it as someone who knew her own worth and had claimed her own future, regardless of cost. The girl who had watched Edmund Whitmore monopolize her dance card with numb resignation was gone, replaced by a woman who had stood in the center of Buckingham Palace's ballroom and declared her love publicly, who had faced down scandal and judgment and emerged stronger for it. Sebastian handed her into the carriage and settled beside her, immediately pulling her close with the easy affection of someone who no longer felt the need to maintain careful distance. And as they rolled through the London streets toward her father's house, Georgiana felt peace settling over her like a warm blanket. "I was so afraid you would not come," she admitted quietly. "When the messenger said you had gone to Kent, I thought I had lost you before I even had the chance to fight for you." "I almost did not," Sebastian confessed. "I spent 2 days convincing myself that you would be better off without me, that the honorable thing was to disappear and let you salvage your reputation. But then your father's message arrived, and I realized something." He turned to face her, his expression serious in the dim light of the carriage. "I realized that by trying to protect you through absence, I was making the same mistake I made in India, deciding for someone else what they could and could not handle, taking away their agency in the name of protection. You deserved the chance to make your own choice, even if that choice was me despite all the complications that came with it. "And you rode through the night to get here," Georgiana said, touching his face gently. "Yes," Sebastian agreed, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "I rode through the night and walked into Buckingham Palace, looking like a vagrant because missing your moment of courage was unthinkable. You fought for me when no one ever has. The least I could do was show up to fight beside you." They arrived at her father's house, and Sebastian walked her to the door, and in the privacy of the shadowed entrance, he kissed her again with a tenderness that made her knees weak. "I love you," he said simply. "I know I have not said it yet tonight, too caught up in proposals and public declarations, but I love you, Georgiana Fairfax, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of the gift you have given me by choosing to stand by my side." "I love you too," Georgiana replied, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "And you do not need to prove anything. You already gave me the greatest gift anyone could give, which was treating me as though my choices mattered, as though I was more than a transaction or a solution to a problem. You saw me, Sebastian, really saw me, and that changed everything." The door opened, and Lord Fairfax stood in the entrance hall with tears in his eyes and a smile on his face, and he embraced Sebastian with the warmth of a father welcoming a son, telling him that he would be honored to have such a man marry his daughter, that anyone who made Georgiana smile the way she was smiling now had his blessing and his gratitude. Sebastian promised to call the following day to discuss settlements and wedding arrangements, though he made clear that Georgiana would have equal say in all decisions regarding their future, and Lord Fairfax had laughed and said he would expect nothing less given the woman his daughter had become. Georgiana watched Sebastian's carriage disappear into the night, and then turned to her father with happiness radiating from every pore. "Thank you, Papa," she said quietly, "for sending that message to Kent, for supporting my choice even when it seemed mad, for believing that I deserved to choose my own path." Lord Fairfax hugged her tightly. "Your mother always said that the women in our family were made of stronger stuff than most," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I think she would be proud of the woman you have become, the courage you showed tonight. I know I am." As Georgiana prepared for bed that night, her maid chattering excitedly about the romantic proposal and the shock on everyone's faces when the Duke had burst into the ballroom, she caught sight of herself in the looking-glass and barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked radiant, alive in a way she had never been before, her eyes bright with happiness and her smile genuine and unforced. This was who she was meant to be, she realized, not the resigned girl accepting whatever fate handed her, but a woman who claimed her own happiness and fought for her own future and refused to let society's judgment define her worth. Across London in his Mayfair townhouse, Sebastian sat in his study and stared at the ring he had commissioned weeks ago, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds that he had ordered on impulse after their third dance together, long before the garden party scandal, long before he had consciously admitted to himself that he was falling in love. Tomorrow he would give it to Georgiana, and they would begin planning their life together. But tonight he allowed himself simply to marvel at the unexpected turn his life had taken, from a man determined to remain alone to someone who could not imagine facing the future without the woman who had seen past his walls and chosen him anyway. The season was not yet over. There would be more balls and social events where he and Georgiana would face whispers and speculation and the slow process of society adjusting to their engagement. But none of that mattered now because they had each other, and they had made their choice publicly and permanently. Sebastian thought about his mother, trapped in a loveless marriage to his cold father, withering slowly under the weight of duty without desire, and he silently promised her that he would not make her mistakes, that the marriage he was entering would be built on partnership and respect and genuine love rather than transaction and obligation. The rain that had been threatening all evening finally began to fall, gentle drops pattering against the windows, and Sebastian stood and moved to look out at the wet London streets, thinking about how much had changed since the night he had watched Georgiana dance with Edmund Whitmore and felt something crack open inside his chest. He had thought he was rescuing her with his outrageous offer to buy her dance cards, but the truth was they had rescued each other. Two people scarred by their parents' mistakes, who had found in each other the courage to risk happiness, despite every reason to choose safety instead. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the practical details of merging lives and managing scandal and building a future together. But tonight, Sebastian allowed himself simply to feel grateful that he had been brave enough, or foolish enough, or desperate enough to walk into Lord Fairfax's study with an unprecedented proposal, and that Georgiana had been brave enough to accept it despite all the uncertainties it entailed. The city settled into sleep around him, London's endless rhythm of life continuing regardless of individual dramas, and Sebastian finally headed to his own bed with a smile on his face and hope in his heart, knowing that when morning came, he would wake to a future that was uncertain but full of possibility. A future he would face not alone, but with the woman who had changed everything, simply by choosing to see him not as the cold Duke society believed him to be, but as the man he actually was beneath all his carefully constructed defenses. Spring had returned to London with the same inevitable rhythm that governed the social season, bringing with it cherry blossoms and warm breezes and the annual migration of aristocratic families from their country estates to their townhouses in Mayfair. And as Georgiana stood before the looking-glass in her dressing room, while her maid fastened the final hooks of her gown, she marveled at how completely different this spring felt from the one that had preceded it, how the anxiety and resignation that had colored every moment of last season had been replaced by contentment so profound it sometimes made her breath catch with gratitude. She was dressed in silk the color of new leaves, the gown specially designed to accommodate her obviously pregnant figure without attempting to hide it, because she and Sebastian had decided early in their marriage that they would not pretend or dissemble about anything, that their life together would be built on honesty, even when honesty was uncomfortable or unfashionable. The past 6 months had passed in a blur of happiness, punctuated by the usual adjustments of learning to share life with another person, and Georgiana had discovered that marriage to Sebastian was nothing like the cold arrangement she had witnessed between his parents, or the transactional union she had nearly accepted with Edmund, but rather a partnership built on genuine affection and mutual respect, and the kind of deep friendship that made even mundane moments feel significant. They had divided their time between Sebastian's estate in Kent, where the spring air was sweet with apple blossoms, and the pace of life moved according to seasons rather than social obligations, and a smaller townhouse they had purchased together in London, deliberately choosing a property in a less fashionable neighborhood rather than the massive, cold Ashford house where Sebastian had grown up, surrounded by his father's disapproval and his mother's quiet despair. Sebastian appeared in the doorway of her dressing room, impossibly handsome in his evening clothes, and his eyes softened as they always did when he looked at her, particularly now when her pregnancy was evident in the gentle swell of her belly, and the glow that everyone assured her made her more beautiful than ever. "You look radiant," he said, crossing to place a gentle kiss on her temple, his hand settling naturally on her stomach in a gesture that had become habitual over the past months. "Are you certain you feel up to attending tonight? I know the charity work is important to you, but I would rather you rest if you are tired." Georgiana turned to smile at him, this man who had transformed from the cold, distant Duke of Ashford into someone who showed his emotions openly, at least in private, though he still maintained a certain reserve in public that she found endearing rather than frustrating, because she knew the warmth beneath it was reserved for her. "I am perfectly well," she assured him, "and tonight is too important to miss. The foundation has raised enough money to open a second house for women escaping difficult marriages, and I want to thank all the patrons personally for their support." The charitable foundation had been Georgiana's idea, born from her own experience of nearly being trapped in a loveless marriage, and Sebastian's painful history with his mother's suffering. And over the past 4 months since their wedding, she had thrown herself into the work with the same determination she had shown when standing up to society's judgment at the Royal Charity Ball. The foundation provided safe housing and financial support for women trying to leave abusive or desperately unhappy marriages, helping them establish independence rather than forcing them to choose between misery and destitution. And the work had given Georgiana's new position as Duchess of Ashford a purpose beyond social obligations and household management. Sebastian had supported the foundation, both financially and emotionally, using his influence to encourage other wealthy men to contribute, and his own painful history to convince skeptics that the cause was worthy. And Georgiana loved him even more for his willingness to be vulnerable in service of helping others. The Duke and Duchess of Pembroke's estate blazed with light as their carriage approached. The opening ball of the new season always held at this magnificent property that rivaled even the grandest royal venues, and Georgiana felt a flutter of nerves that had nothing to do with anxiety and everything to do with the contrast between this arrival and the one she had made at Lady Hertford's ball almost exactly 1 year ago. Then she had been desperate and resigned, accepting Edmund's proprietary claim on her time because she had no other choice, watching the evening unfold with the numb awareness that her future was being decided by financial necessity rather than personal desire. Now she arrived as Sebastian's wife, secure in his love and her own worth, no longer performing for society's approval, but simply living her life according to principles she and Sebastian had chosen together. The majordomo announced them as the Duke and Duchess of Ashford, and Georgiana felt the familiar weight of eyes turning toward them, but the quality of attention was different now, warm rather than judgmental, curious about her obvious pregnancy rather than scandalized by their unconventional courtship. They descended into the ballroom together, Sebastian's hand protective at the small of her back, and people approached to congratulate them on the impending arrival, to express admiration for Georgiana's charitable work, to generally treat them as the established couple they had become rather than the scandal they had once represented. The Ton had largely accepted their match in the end, won over by the obvious romance of their story and by Georgiana's charm as she settled into her role as Duchess, and while there were still a few older matrons who sniffed disapprovingly and whispered about propriety, most of society had moved on to newer scandals and fresher gossip. More importantly, Georgiana had discovered that their unconventional beginning had inspired other young women to demand more from their own courtships, to refuse matches based purely on financial advantage, to believe that genuine affection was possible even within the constraints of arranged marriages if both parties approached them with honesty and respect. The ballroom was decorated with spring flowers, cherry blossoms, and early roses filling the air with delicate fragrance, and the atmosphere was one of celebration and renewal rather than the oppressive formality Georgiana remembered from the previous season. The orchestra played from the same mezzanine level, but tonight the music sounded joyful rather than merely elegant, and as Sebastian led her toward the dance floor for the opening waltz, Georgiana felt happiness bubbling up in her chest like champagne. "Do you remember that first ball?" she asked as they began to move together with the perfect synchronization that months of dancing had only enhanced. "You looked like you wanted to murder Lord Whitmore." Sebastian laughed, the sound genuine and unguarded in a way that still sometimes surprised her, because it was so different from the cold reserve he had maintained when they first met. "I did," he admitted. "I watched him treat you like a possession he had already acquired, announcing his intention to propose as though you had no say in the matter, and something in me just snapped. I had come to the ball intending to stay only long enough to fulfill social obligation, but then I saw you, and I could not leave." Georgiana looked up at him with curiosity that had been building for months. "You did not even know me then," she pointed out. "How could you have such a strong reaction to a stranger's treatment?" Sebastian's expression grew serious, his grey eyes holding hers with the honesty that characterized everything about their relationship now. "Did I not know you?" he countered. "I saw everything I needed to see in those few hours. Your grace under pressure, your dignity despite the humiliation Whitmore was subjecting you to, the way you kept smiling even though your eyes were dying inside with each proprietary touch and presumptuous word. I recognized myself in you, another person trapped by duty and expectation, trying to maintain composure while drowning in resignation." His hand tightened on her waist. "Every wall I had built to protect myself from feeling anything, every vow I had made to remain alone, all of it just cracked when I watched you suffer through that evening. I spent all night in my study trying to convince myself to let it go, to let you accept Whitmore's suit because it was not my place to interfere. But by morning, I knew I could not live with myself if I did not at least try to give you another option." Georgiana felt tears prick her eyes at the raw honesty in his voice. "I never knew," she whispered. "I thought it was pity or perhaps some abstract principle about protecting women from bad marriages because of what happened to your mother. I did not realize you were already falling in love with me even then." "I did not realize it either," Sebastian confessed. "I told myself it was about giving you choice, about preventing another woman from being trapped as my mother was trapped. And those things were true. But underneath all those noble justifications was the simple fact that I saw you, and something fundamental shifted inside me, something I had thought permanently frozen after years of watching my parents' cold marriage. And I wanted desperately to know if you might feel even a fraction of what I was beginning to feel." They completed the waltz in comfortable silence, and when the music ended, Sebastian led her from the floor to where refreshments had been arranged, procuring her a glass of cool water and insisting she sit for a moment, despite her protests that she was perfectly capable of standing. A young woman approached nervously, one of this season's debutantes, her eyes bright with the kind of desperate hope Georgiana remembered all too well from her own presentation. "Your Grace," the girl said, curtsying with careful precision. "Might I have a moment of your time? I have heard such wonderful things about your charity work, and I wanted to ask, well, is it true that you refused a viscount to marry the Duke? How did you find such courage?" Georgiana smiled gently at the girl, recognizing in her anxious expression the same fears and doubts that had plagued her own debut season. "I decided I would rather fail at choosing my own path than succeed at living someone else's life," she said simply. "It is terrifying to go against what everyone expects, what duty demands, but I found that the terror of losing myself was worse than the terror of facing society's judgment." The young woman's eyes filled with tears. "My parents have arranged a match for me with a man I barely know," she confessed quietly. "He is wealthy and titled, and by all accounts a good match, but when I am with him I feel like I am disappearing, like the person I actually am does not matter as long as I fulfill the role he expects. I do not know if I have the strength to refuse." Georgiana reached out to squeeze the girl's hand. "Only you can decide what you are willing to accept," she said gently. "But I will tell you what I wish someone had told me, which is that you deserve to be seen as a whole person, not just as a solution to a financial problem or a decorative addition to someone's household. If the man your parents have chosen makes you feel invisible now, marriage will only make that worse. Better to face uncertainty alone than certainty with someone who does not value who you actually are." The young woman thanked her with visible emotion and hurried away, and Georgiana turned to find Sebastian watching her with an expression of such pride and affection that it made her breath catch. "You are going to change the world," he said quietly. "One conversation at a time, one woman at a time, teaching them that they deserve better than what society tells them to accept." Georgiana leaned against his shoulder, tired now but content. "We are changing it together," she corrected. "Your willingness to support the foundation, to use your influence to help women escape bad situations, That matters just as much as my conversations with frightened debutantes. The evening progressed, and Georgiana found herself sitting out several dances, her energy flagging as it often did now in her 5th month of pregnancy. But Sebastian refused every request from other ladies to dance, settling instead beside her with his hand resting possessively on her knee. "I bought every dance with you for the season," he reminded her with a smile when Lady Pembroke suggested he might partner her daughter for a set. "That deal has not expired, and I have no interest in dancing with anyone else." Across the ballroom, Georgiana spotted Edmund Whitmore standing with a young woman she did not recognize, a sweet-faced blonde with gentle eyes and a shy smile, and she was surprised to feel nothing but mild curiosity rather than the anger or hurt she might have expected. Edmund looked different somehow, less puffed up with his own importance, more relaxed in his companion's presence than Georgiana had ever seen him, and when he noticed her watching, he made his way over with visible hesitation. "Your Grace," he said formally, bowing to both her and Sebastian. "May I introduce Miss Henrietta Gardiner, my fiancée? We plan to marry in the autumn." Georgiana smiled warmly at Miss Gardiner, who seemed genuinely kind rather than merely proper, and she felt happy for Edmund in a distant sort of way. "Congratulations, Lord Whitmore," she said sincerely. "I wish you both every happiness." Edmund's expression shifted to something almost like regret. "I owe you an apology, Miss Fairfax. That is, Your Grace," he said quietly. "I convinced myself I was trying to protect you from scandal, when in truth I was simply angry that you had chosen someone else. My methods were cruel, and my motivations were selfish, and I am sorry for the pain I caused." Georgiana appreciated the apology, even as she recognized that Edmund would probably never fully understand what he had done wrong, that his capacity for genuine empathy was limited by his fundamental self-absorption. "Your apology is accepted," she said gently. "I hope you have found in Miss Gardiner a partner better suited to your temperament than I ever would have been." Edmund nodded, clearly relieved, and Sebastian extended his hand for a brief handshake, the gesture civil if not warm, an acknowledgement that the rivalry between them had ended even if friendship would never be possible. As Edmund and his fiancée moved away, Sebastian turned to Georgiana with curiosity. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. Refusing his suit, facing all the scandal and judgment, choosing a path that was so much harder than simply accepting what everyone expected. "Never," Georgiana said firmly. "Not for a single moment. Even in the hardest times, when society was whispering about us and I was terrified we had made a terrible mistake, I never regretted choosing you over safety." The ballroom had grown warm and crowded as the evening progressed, and when Georgiana expressed a desire for fresh air, Sebastian immediately offered his arm and led her through the French doors into the gardens, where spring had transformed the grounds into something magical. Cherry blossoms drifted on the breeze like snow, early roses perfumed the air with sweetness, and jasmine climbed the garden walls, filling the night with its intoxicating scent. A fountain played in the center of the formal garden, its gentle splash providing peaceful counterpoint to the music drifting from the ballroom, and overhead the full moon cast silver light across the carefully tended paths. They walked in comfortable silence, Georgiana's hand tucked into Sebastian's elbow, until they reached a secluded bench beneath a willow tree, where the shadows provided privacy from the other couples strolling the gardens. Sebastian guided her to sit and then knelt before her, his hand settling gently on her rounded stomach, with the reverent care he always showed when touching her pregnancy. The baby kicked, a strong flutter against his palm, and Sebastian's face lit with wonder and joy that never seemed to diminish no matter how many times he felt their child move. "Thank you," he said quietly, his eyes finding hers in the moonlight, "for fighting for us when I had given up, for standing in front of all of London and declaring that you chose me despite every reason to choose safety instead. For giving me this," he gestured to her stomach, to the garden around them, to the life they had built together. I spent years certain I would be alone, convinced it was safety when it was really just fear. You showed me the difference." Georgiana reached down to cup his face, her thumb tracing the line of his cheekbone. "We fought for each other," she corrected gently. "That is what equals do. You gave me choice when no one else thought I deserved it. You saw me as a whole person rather than a commodity. And you loved me enough to let me go if that was what I needed. How could I not fight for that? For you. For us." Sebastian rose and settled beside her on the bench, pulling her close against his side. "And now?" he asked, his hand returning to rest on her stomach. "Are you happy, truly happy? Or do you sometimes wish for the easier path you might have had?" Georgiana laughed softly. "Even when I am enormous and can barely dance," she teased. "Even when society still whispers about our scandalous courtship, and I am too tired to attend half the events we are invited to. You are asking if I am happy?" Sebastian kissed the top of her head. "Especially then," he said. "Especially when you are carrying our future and tired from the important work you are doing and still so beautiful, it makes my chest ache to look at you. How could I love you more than I do in moments like this?" Georgiana turned in his arms to kiss him properly, a long, slow kiss that tasted of champagne and happiness, and the complete certainty that they had chosen correctly, despite all the obstacles and judgment they had faced. "I am happier than I ever imagined possible," she said when they finally broke apart. "I did not know life could feel like this, that marriage could be partnership rather than possession, that love could be both passionate and peaceful at the same time. You gave me all of that, Sebastian, and I would choose you again every single day for the rest of my life." The music from the ballroom shifted to a waltz, the familiar strains carrying clearly across the garden, and Sebastian stood and offered his hand with the same gallantry he had shown that first night when he had tried to claim the final dance from Edmund's possessive grip. "May I have this dance, Your Grace?" he asked formally, but his eyes were warm with affection and gentle teasing. Georgiana took his hand and let him pull her to her feet, settling into his arms with the ease of long practice as they began to move together in the moonlit garden. They danced slowly, mindful of her pregnancy and the uneven ground, but perfectly synchronized in the way that only came from months of dancing together and the deep understanding they had built through honesty and vulnerability and choosing each other again and again. Around them the garden bloomed with spring flowers, the fountain played its gentle song, and overhead the stars wheeled in their eternal patterns, indifferent to human drama, but somehow making the moment feel blessed anyway. Other couples moved through the shadows, stealing kisses and murmured conversations, but Georgiana and Sebastian were lost in their own world, completely absorbed in each other and the life they were building together. The Duke and Duchess, who had scandalized London society by refusing to accept anything less than genuine love and equal partnership, who had stood against judgment and expectation and chosen their own path despite its cost, who had transformed from two wounded people hiding behind walls of self-protection into partners who faced everything together with honesty and courage and abiding affection. As the waltz ended, and they stood swaying gently in each other's arms, Georgiana rested her head against Sebastian's chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart, and she felt profound gratitude for the courage she had found to speak her truth at the royal charity ball, for Sebastian's willingness to ride through the night to stand beside her, for the life that had unfolded from those moments of bravery when they had both chosen love over safety and partnership over possession. Inside the ballroom, the season's festivities continued, young debutantes hoping for advantageous matches and mothers plotting social strategy and the endless dance of courtship and marriage that would replay itself season after season for as long as society existed. But out in the moonlit garden beneath the cherry blossoms, with Sebastian's arms around her and their child moving gently beneath her heart, Georgiana knew that she and Sebastian had written a different story, one that would perhaps inspire other young women to demand more from their suitors and their lives, to believe that genuine happiness was possible even within the constraints of their world if they had the courage to choose it. The future stretched ahead, full of possibility and uncertainty in equal measure, children to raise and a foundation to grow, and the daily work of building a marriage based on mutual respect and genuine partnership. But Georgiana faced it all with confidence, born from knowing that whatever challenges came, she would meet them with Sebastian by her side, two equals who had chosen each other freely and would keep choosing each other every day for the rest of their lives. And as they finally turned to walk back toward the glowing ballroom, hand in hand, Georgiana thought about the girl she had been 1 year ago, desperate and resigned, and convinced her only value lay in her willingness to accept whatever match would save her family from ruin, and she marveled at how completely she had transformed into someone who knew her own worth and demanded to be seen as a whole person rather than a commodity. That transformation had been painful and frightening and wonderful all at once, requiring courage she had not known she possessed and faith in possibilities she had barely dared to imagine. But every moment of struggle had been worth it for the joy of building a life based on genuine love rather than cold transaction, for the privilege of being truly known by another person and choosing to know them in return, for the simple, profound happiness of dancing in a moonlit garden with the man who had given her choice and partnership and the freedom to become fully herself.